Now, do you know what boiler room tactics are? Well, today, 3 British citizens are facing sentencing for their part in the UK's biggest boiler room scam. It's a scam that involved 2,300 victims and some $100 million were lost. The 3 men have been found guilty of using high-pressure boiler room tactics to dupe investors into buying non-existent shares. Let's talk to Timur Rustem, managing partner of the law firm Rustem and Guardian here in London. They specialise in defending people accused of running boiler room scams. Welcome to the programme.
Hello.
Just tell us, explain in a little bit more detail what boiler room scams involve. What is it?
Essentially, boiler rooms, the term boiler room refers to a high pressure environment for selling. Essentially, stocks and shares primarily, but it can be real estate and other things. Typically, you have cold calling initially of proposed victims. You then have a high pressure sales tactic employed, often selling to elderly people inexperienced in shares and stocks, with follow-on sales thereafter. You find there is an industry created for the selling of information, people's personal details, to company by company, so that basically you find the same person being targeted time and again.
And does it tend to be, if you're talking about sort of cold calling and setting up call centre type situations, it relatively new, this sort of tactic?
No. This has been on the scene since the 1970s, perhaps earlier. A lot in the 1990s with dot-com companies, pretty much now resurrected. I think the recession has probably seen an increase in the numbers of these type of companies. People now are receiving redundancy packages and so on, getting very little returns in terms of their savings. So it's making people perhaps more amenable to approaches for proposed or promised high yield returns. So you're seeing primarily countries such as Spain, the Far East, Malta, Switzerland, Dubai as centres of effectively unlicensed brokerage firms targeting UK nationals for the selling of stocks and shares.
So the unlicensed part is the illegal part? Which part of this is illegal?
Well, there are many different types of boiler room scam, but the traditional type is selling either stocks and shares that don't exist, or which perhaps are hugely inflated values, or indeed have restrictions on their sale.
And just give us an idea of how this would work in practice then, that they cold call. How do they identify who the potential victims are going to be?
Well, often when we give our information out, our details, there is a knock-on effect where there is that information sold on company by company, and they use that to target their proposed victims. They're normally about 65 plus, the people they target, and the average fraud is about £20,000. So you're talking about targeting people who are not really experienced in dealing with stocks and shares.
And so relatively easy to persuade.
Absolutely. And what they'll often do is put a time pressure on the sale, promise high yield returns, often with a secrecy clause in there so they don't invite you to make inquiries. Essentially, any company which purports to sell stocks and shares to a UK resident must be registered with the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK.
And in this instance, in this particular case, these 3 men who are awaiting sentencing, is this a particularly significant case because of the number of victims involved, the amount of money that was lost?
It's the amount of money involved. It's purported to be £100 million plus. You often don't know exactly the extent of the fraud because it depends on who comes forward, victims. My understanding is there's at least 1,000 victims in this case. This is probably the largest one that we've seen. It's interesting that it's in America because Florida has long been seen as the capital of boiler room frauds within the US. So it's increasingly seeing the US government now begin to target and close these.
And what about the legislation then? And what exists that can tighten the controls over people who want to set these sorts of companies up?
I think the difficulty is that they're often the companies that are selling them are based abroad. We see a lot of them in Spain, in Barcelona, Valencia and other centres. And that's part of the problem. The jurisdiction, the government, the authority that should deal with this, whether it be the City of London Police or the Financial Services or Financial Conduct Authority, are in the UK. So they find it jurisdictionally difficult to actually investigate and prosecute. Unless they have cooperation from the country within which the operation is being conducted, it is very difficult.
Does it mean then that they're quite easy cases to defend?
Not at all, not at all. To give you an example, this case itself, we've seen an investigation that sometimes goes on for 2 or 3 years. The number of victims involved, the number of information involved means huge amounts of resources are allocated by the state prosecuting and investigating. And equally, from a defence point of view, it's often very difficult because you're talking about huge amounts of data. So you see there's a very small number of firms that will often defend these cases with the experience that they have.
Timur Rustem, managing partner of the law firm Rustem and Guardian. I've certainly learned something today. Thanks very much for coming in.